Period six is super, super important. And it's important because this is the era in which America goes from being a largely agricultural society to becoming a industrial society, and not only an industrial society, but an industrial power, an economic powerhouse in the world. And so it's an era of massive transformation within the United States. And you have to understand, how that process is happening, but you also need to understand how all the different pieces fit together. There's an enormous amount of connections that are going on, and we're going to go through three stories today, but in understanding that those three stories aren't separate from one another. That's super important. So let's talk about the time frame, and then I'll get into those stories themselves. So the time frame for this era is between 1865 and really 1898. So 1865 is the end of the Civil War. That's going to begin that's going to be the start of this time period. And then it goes all the way up to 1898, which is the Spanish-American War, because imperialism really is the next period and the next era that we're going to talk about. Now, some really interesting things about period six is that there is some overlap between period six and period five. You need to note that. Period five actually goes up through 1877. So at the very beginning of period six, even though we're not talking about it right now, there is Reconstruction that's going on in the South. And then the emergence of the New South that happens afterwards is during this time period too. So you just got to chronologically keep those things in your mind so that you understand the chronology and the history and how it lines up with some of the other things that we've talked about already. So let's get into the different stories, and I'm going to walk you through it. So the first and maybe the most important story of period six, the one that stands out hopefully to you right away when you think about this time period, is big business. And our first story is the rise of heavy industry. So it's not the beginning of industrialization in the United States. The beginnings of industrialization can be traced back to the market revolution in period four. And we see like textile mills emerge, and those mills oftentimes were next to rivers. And there's like the very, very sprinklings of industry in America. What's different about this time period, because that is one of the biggest areas of confusion for students, is they don't, like, what's the difference between the second industrial revolution and the rise of big business in this era and the market revolution? How are those two different? Well, they're different because in this time period, you've got much, much bigger businesses that are emerging. What they're producing is different. So we go from textiles in period four to all of a sudden now heavy industry. We're talking about steel. We're talking about oil. And we're going to see those businesses become the dominant forces in this time period, as opposed to period four, that they like, even though those businesses were emerging, they're not like the driving forces of our economy. Our economy was still largely agricultural in period four. And in period six, we're seeing more and more people and just make their living in big business. And so like America's going through this shift from a agricultural society to an industrial society. We're seeing the end of the whole Jeffersonian dream of the small yeoman farmer as the average American, to all of a sudden now it is a factory worker is how a lot of people are becoming employed. So what are the things that you need to know? Really, you should know that I'm going to start with technology. It's not in order here, but like there are new technologies that emerge in period six that allow for new industries to kind of develop after the Civil War. So like in the 1850s, you got the Bessemer steel process, which makes it possible to mass produce steel. That is going to give rise to a steel industry that's going to transform the economy of the United States, which is driven by Andrew Carnegie, who's pictured here. There is like the expansion of the railroads. The railroads become one of the driving forces for industrialization in period six. Now, railroads existed before this time period, but it's after the Civil War that railroads massively expand, start to crisscross all parts of the country, and we even start to see railroads connect the East Coast to the West Coast. The best example of the expansion of railroads during this time period is the Transcontinental Railroad, which is the first railroad that links the East Coast to the West Coast. And all of a sudden, transportation times are dramatically cut from one part of the country to the other. We see improvements in communication. So in like the end of period 4, you have the telegraph, which was the first form of electronic communication. And that is like expanding during this time period. But by the 1870s, there's new forms of communication that make it even easier for people to connect and link up over long distances. Alexander Graham Bell and the creation of the telephone in the 1870s does that. And then by the end of period like 6, you've got the creation of like the light bulb, and you've got the spread of electricity. So Thomas Edison not only invents the light bulb, but he helps found the company, the Thomas Edison Light Company, which eventually becomes General Electric, or GE. And GE helps link up and wire up the country so that America, especially cities, are now using electric power, and this is going to allow for even more innovation during this time period. So what are the dominating businesses during this time period? You need to know the kind of the important businesses that are fueling our economy during this time period, and you also need to know who are the men that are associated with those businesses. So during this time period, you've got these like titans of industry. Andrew Carnegie, who is pioneering steel. You've got John Rockefeller, who is pioneering oil. You've got Vanderbilt, who is helping expand railroads. You've got J.P. Morgan and Thomas Edison, J.P. Morgan's a banker, but he's also the #1 investor in Thomas Edison's electric light company, which eventually becomes General Electric. So these industries are really kind of developing the economy. And it's these industries that are, for the most part, driving America during this time period, less so than government. And government, especially after Reconstruction, is taking a back seat to business. So we see this is the era of, for example, laissez-faire. So the government is very uninvolved in regulating business, and anything that the government is doing is, for the most part, just to help businesses. Like I said, they help create land grants for railroads so those railroads can expand. As businesses start to see conflicts with their workers, the government during this time period is, for the most part, staying out of it or siding with those businesses. So, it is a very business-friendly environment during this time period. Now, what that means is during this time period, we've got like some changes in some of the social dynamic in the United States. So we've got some few people who are becoming ultra wealthy as a result of the rise of these massive corporations like Standard Oil and like U.S. Steel. Carnegie, one of the wealthiest people in the world. In fact, in some cases, like he and J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller had more money than the government had, and so we're seeing this gap that's growing between like these wealthy people who are who have tons of concentrated wealth, and then like the poor worker. And so workers who are losing control of their work, who are seeing their work devalued, begin to try to fight for better working conditions. One of the things that is happening during this time period is businesses are making lots of money. They're growing our economy, but they're doing it at the expense of the worker. And so workers begin to not only form the first national labor unions, but they also see a series of strikes during this time period that represents that growing conflict. So we've got the National Labor Union as the first national labor union. That makes sense. But they're quickly replaced later on by the Knights of Labor. And then by the end of the time period, the AFL, or American Federation of Labor. There's a series of well-known strikes during this time period, including the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Pullman Strike, and there's even the rise of a socialist movement, which is led by Eugene Debs by the end of this time period. There is also a anti-monopoly or antitrust movement during this time period. And while they succeed in passing the Sherman Antitrust Act, it is not enforced because, as we remember, as I said earlier, it's a period of laissez-faire. Right? So let's keep going. So that's big business. Make sure you know that story. It is like absolutely quintessential for knowing this period. The second thing is urbanization and the development of cities. because America is moving from a rural society to a industrial society, people are going to move to where the jobs are. And factories are located in large urban areas. And so people start leaving the farms, they start leaving these rural, smaller areas, and they're attracted to cities where we see populations explode. And like, obviously that provides the workforce for big business during this time period. Now, obviously there's people moving to cities. That's one reason that cities are growing. But another major reason why cities are growing is because of immigration. So let's talk a little bit about immigration. You have to understand that there's this huge wave of immigrants that are going to be flooding into the United States during this period after the Civil War. And they're attracted for a number of reasons. They're attracted by the economic opportunities that are offered in America. They're attracted by like the lure of democracy that America is well known for. They're being pushed out of their home countries because of maybe like poor economic conditions or war. And so they're coming into the United States in huge numbers that really are bigger than we've really seen but prior to this time period. And if you want more information about immigration, I did do a review on immigration that you can check out. That'll be posted on Canvas. I did a review on that last week. But some things that you absolutely have to know about immigration during this time period is, number one, these are what we call new immigrants. They're immigrants that are coming from places that hadn't come before. And so they're coming from mainly Southern and Eastern European countries. So we see like a larger number of Italian immigrants, Jewish immigrants, Greek immigrants, Russian immigrants. And these are countries that hadn't sent a lot of people to the United States prior to this era. We also see continued immigration in the West, which I'll talk about more in a second, in the form of like Chinese immigration and Japanese immigration. And so like these immigrants are coming into these cities and building up the populations in these areas like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago. They end up settling in primarily what we call ethnic neighborhoods. These ethnic neighborhoods, which are made up of, they're areas of the city that are made up primarily of immigrants from like their same like regions. They serve as almost like a form of protection for these immigrants and help them transition into life in America. Now, something that you have to know is that as they come in, they are also protected by the rise of something called political machines. Now, this is super important because this is a major area of confusion during the year. Political machines are not monopolies. Do not tell me that political machines are monopolies. They're local political parties in cities. Usually they were Democratic. They usually came from the Democratic Party, who essentially had like constant control over that city. And they got like the same people reelected to office over and over again. And the way they were able to do that was they oftentimes provided resources for these immigrants that were coming in. And then in return, they asked for favors. And one of the big favors was that they asked for these immigrants to come in and vote for them, like all over and over again. The problem was that because they had so much power and they really weren't seriously threatened from being, I guess, losing office like from a challenger, that they did oftentimes become corrupt. And so you see some of these political machines skimming off the top, taking taxpayer dollars and pocketing it for themselves. Probably the best example of this is Tammany Hall, which was in New York, and it was run by a political, we call party boss named Boss Tweed. Now, the conditions in these cities, as the size of these cities grew, was not great. During this time period, we start to see people living further and further from away from their job, as we see more public transportation emerge in these cities. We call that streetcar cities. As streetcars emerge in order to transport people from one area to another of a city, it makes cities kind of closer to how we think of cities today. But some of the, like, obviously there was nice areas of the city just like today, but there's also a lot of poverty. And in areas where there's poverty, which also sometimes was areas that consisted of ethnic neighborhoods, we see like buildings that aren't well maintained. There weren't a lot of building codes at the time. You see the creation of something called dumbbell tenements. And these tenements were poorly ventilated, they were overly crowded, and they were in generally not good places to live. We also see the creation of the first skyscrapers as steel becomes a way of, like building and constructing cities. As the real estate becomes more valuable, people start building up. We see the first skyscrapers in Chicago, and obviously that'll spread to other parts of the country. And then we also see the creation of the first amusement in cities. We see like a growth of consumerism as places like Woolworths and Macy's and other shops develop to cater to the public. And so all of this is coming about, developing a kind of an urban culture at this time period. The last thing you need to know is within this urban culture, you should be aware of the fact that there was growing concern about the conditions that people were facing. And so there emerged like reformers who wanted to fix the growing problems in cities. These like reformers are going to be super important because they're going to help kind of inspire the progressive era that will come in next in period 7. So Jane Addams is one of the first social workers in America, and she establishes Hull House in Chicago. She's an example of someone who is guided by what we call the social gospel. And in this time period, throughout history, there have been eras of what we call religious revivals. The first Great Awakening is one. The second Great Awakening is another. There's a new religious revival in the late 1800s that is based off this idea that we should apply Christian values to the poverty and problems in the cities during this time period. And the social gospel becomes that movement that wants to attract religious people to try to help the poor in some of these cities. They also want to obviously improve morality. And so the women's Christian temperance movement and the emergence of another movement to stop the spread of, to stop drinking is also related to that. All right, last story, super important. We oftentimes forget about it, and we can't, because you could get a full DBQ question about this, and that, to be honest, wouldn't surprise me on the day of the AP test. So our last story is that as America is becoming more industrial, America is settling all parts of the United States, and as a result, the frontier, the West, which had been, basically this open space, is all of a sudden being closed. America is starting to settle all parts of the West, and as they do that, conflicts emerge. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's begin by just talking about why it was settled. It was settled primarily because of two things. Number one, improvements in transportation. So the Transcontinental Railroad allowed people to move into the West much, much faster. But the other thing that's pushing people is economic opportunities out west, like especially after the Civil War. So after the Civil War is open, there's the gold frontier and the mining frontier that attracts people to different gold booms around the West, for example, there's the Comstock lode that happens in Nevada. And there's a bunch of these different gold rushes that occur all over the West that attract miners out there. There's the cattle frontier, and people are attracted to the Texas and the Southeast to raise cattle, to produce that for profit. And ranching becomes a new form of economic prosperity during this time period. And then you've got farming. A lot of people are drawn by the new land. During the Civil War in 1862, the Homestead Act basically gave away land by the federal government for either free or cheap so that people could go and settle on the plains and get 160 acres if they could stay and modify that land. All this stuff is in your Quizlet terms. Please check it out if you want more information. But what ends up happening is as people move out west, really we see a number of conflicts emerge. And there's three major conflicts that I want you to be aware of. The first is with Native Americans, and you have to know this. As Americans are moving out west, they're now competing for land with Native Americans that had been pushed out west in previous time periods. So if we go back to earlier time periods, Indians had been removed from lands in the east and pushed to those lands out west. And so what ends up happening is there's this push by the federal government to start to place Native Americans on reservations. And so we begin in the 1850s, but it continues in the 1860s and 1870s, a series of wars and conflicts between the federal government over over access to land and through the process of trying to place Native Americans on what happens to be smaller and smaller reservations over time. The other, obviously, conflict is that once those Native Americans are on those reservations, we start to see them being assimilated. So by 1887, the federal government changes their policy to try to assimilate Native Americans and force them to accept American culture. And by doing that, they will offer them citizenship for the first time in American history. So that's a major source of conflict. The other second major source of conflict deals with farmers. So what's happening with farmers is that farmers, all these people have moved out west to try to get access to land. And what ends up happening is that their farmers end up struggling. And they struggle for a number of reasons. They struggle because farming is becoming more commercialized, with new inventions like the combine harvester, and small farmers are having a hard time making ends meet. They're also struggling because farmers are becoming more reliant on railroads. And so they see big business and railroads as their enemy. And so for the first time ever in history, farmers begin to organize into their own group, their own political group. We see this first with the Grange movement. We see that later with farm alliances, and then that eventually emerges into the Populist Party. And the Populist Party represents farmers, but they also represent any kind of blue-collar Americans who are struggling against big business. And basically, there's this standoff during this time period between rural America, represented by the Populist Party, and which you have to know, and then urban America and big business. Big business wins in the election of 1896, and we see the Populist Party kind of dwindle, although their ideas go on to affect the Progressive Era. All right. We also see conflicts over the environment. The destruction of the environment leads to new movements, including preservationists who are like John Muir, who are calling for national parks and leaving some land untouched, and eventually an organized environmental movement that is going to continue in the Progressive Era. Now, one other story that's connected to immigration that I'm going to finish up with is I want to go back to what was happening with the Chinese immigrants who were coming in the West. Now, the Chinese immigrants were facing an enormous amount of persecution out west because they were competing with other Americans for land and for jobs and economic opportunities. And so there began during this time period a horrible backlash against the Chinese in the form of the first law ever restricting immigration, which was the Chinese Exclusion Act. And we see that in 1882. And that will only continue to grow. That backlash will continue to grow into period 7. By the end of this time period, the frontier has been, for the most part, conquered. And that's where it takes us to Turner's frontier thesis, which says that America will need to, the frontier has always been the source of American democracy and self-reliance, and it's a safety valve for tension in America. And so America needs to find new frontiers, which will take us to imperialism after this. Okay, so went a little over time there, about 4 minutes. Obviously, I want to try to keep this as short as I possibly can, but this is period 6 in a nutshell. Those are your 3 main stories. A lot of these storylines intersect and connect with one another, and so you need to be able to understand how they link in order to be able to write a good essay for this period, because the reality is that you're probably going to get, if you get a DBQ from this period, like a question that kind of, I guess, overlaps some of these big stories. So knowing those terms, knowing the economic development, that is everything to understanding period 6.